History doesn't repeat, but economic patterns do. For decades, global manufacturing ran on one assumption: China was untouchable. Cheap labor, massive scale, dense supplier webs, and an export machine tuned to ship across the Pacific at low cost. For multinational corporations, China wasn't just an option. It was the default. Stop scrolling for a second, because this is not a China story, the way you think it is. This is a supply chain story, a power story, and honestly, a control story. And the punchline is simple. The world is still buying, still consuming, still ordering at scale, but it's getting a lot less comfortable betting everything on one place. And let me ask you something before we go further. If you were running a billion-dollar supply chain, would you bet your entire business on one country forever? Or would you want a backup plan before the panic starts? For years, the plan looked obvious. If you wanted volume, you went to China. If you wanted speed, you went to China. If you wanted a supplier base that could build anything from a toaster to a car dashboard, you went to China. People didn't even say it as a strategy anymore. They said it like gravity. It was just the way the system works. And right now, that way is breaking quietly like a crack spreading through a wall that still looks solid from a distance. China is still producing. That's not the debate. What changed is what sits behind production: confidence, predictability, and the feeling that you can plan a year ahead without being blindsided. When that feeling goes away, companies don't wait for a disaster. They move, they hedge, they shift the risk. So, if you're asking, did China collapse? The honest answer is, China didn't collapse. The system that made China the single, unquestioned center is the thing that's failing, and as that system slips, Mexico is stepping into the space it leaves behind. You can feel the change in the smallest details. A buyer who used to sign a 12-month contract without blinking now asks for exit clauses. A brand that once bragged about lean inventory now keeps extra stock because it's tired of gambling on shipping calendars. A factory manager who used to optimize for pennies now optimizes for one brutal question: can we actually deliver on time? That's the quiet collapse, not a crash on television, but a million tiny decisions that all move in the same direction. And when enough companies make those tiny decisions, the center of gravity moves even if nobody holds a press conference to announce it. Not because Mexico is perfect, not because Mexico is winning a trophy, but because Mexico is close, connected, and positioned in the one place every company cares about most: the U.S. market. Now here's what most people miss, and this is where the story gets darker and way more interesting. The story isn't just Western companies moving. The story turns when Chinese companies start moving too. Because once China starts building inside Mexico, you're not just watching supply chains move, you're watching power relocate. And here's the question you should keep in your head from this point on. If China can't be the factory next door, will China try to become the factory across the border? Let's be blunt. Distance used to be treated like a detail. Shipping was cheap. Time was predictable. Ports moved like clockwork, and if something went wrong, it usually got fixed before it hit the shelves. That comfort is gone. Here's a way to picture it. In the old setup, you could build a plan like this: order parts in March, ship in April, stock in May, sell in June. It wasn't perfect, but it was predictable enough that CFOs could trust it. And predictability is what makes cheap manufacturing truly cheap, because it keeps your cash from getting trapped in limbo. Now, the same plan feels like guessing. An inspection delay turns into a missed window. A policy change turns into a surprise cost. A single "we'll get back to you" turns into weeks. And when the calendar becomes a question mark, the whole system becomes a question mark. So the shift is not emotional, it's accounting. And this is where working capital starts screaming, if a shipment takes longer. Your cash is tied up longer. If timelines swing, you carry more inventory, just in case. If you carry more inventory, you need more financing. If you need more financing, interest rates suddenly matter a lot more than they used to. So the China model doesn't just risk delays, it can choke your balance sheet. That's why supply chains moved from the operations team to the CFO's desk. And once the CFO is involved, decisions get cold and fast. Reduce exposure, shorten the pipeline, keep the money moving. When uncertainty rises, the cost of distance rises with it, and once distance becomes expensive, the world stops behaving like one single factory floor, and it didn't vanish because one thing happened, it vanished because too many things started happening at the same time, over and over in different forms. One month it's tariffs and political pressure, another month it's a bottleneck, another month it's a new rule, a new inspection, a new restriction. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Companies can live with higher costs. What they can't live with is not knowing which cost hits next. A supply chain that runs across an ocean is not just a line on a map. It's a chain of weak points. It's ports you don't control. It's shipping lanes you can't police. It's regulatory decisions you can't predict. It's a political climate you can't vote in yet. It still decides whether your containers move or sit. And that's where trust breaks. Because when the system is calm, you don't notice how fragile it is. When the system gets noisy, you realize how exposed you are, so companies started doing something that feels almost boring, but changes everything. They started pricing risk like a real cost, not as a footnote, not as a worst case, as a line item that can ruin a quarter, and once you price risk, a China-only backbone stops looking efficient, it starts looking reckless. That's the shift. And don't underestimate how deep the old setup went. China wasn't just a place to build, it was a whole ecosystem. Suppliers next door to suppliers, tooling shops that could turn a design into a mold fast, component makers that could scale overnight, and logistics pipelines tuned for non-stop export. When you build around an ecosystem like that, you get addicted to it. Your purchasing teams learn the shortcuts, your engineers learn the vendors. Your timelines start assuming the network will always be there and always be flexible. So when the network starts feeling risky, companies don't just switch a factory, they have to rebuild habits, relationships, and entire operating routines. That's why the shift looks slow in public, even when it feels urgent in private. And here's the audience question, because this matters. If the biggest companies on Earth are rebuilding their entire operating routines, do you think this is temporary, or do you think the map is being rewritten for a decade? Now, ask yourself a simple question. Where do the goods end up? For a massive slice of global manufacturing, the answer is the United States. So, if the destination is the U.S. and distance is now a risk, the solution almost writes itself. You move closer. You shorten the chain. You reduce the number of things that can break between the factory and the customer. That's why Mexico keeps showing up in every boardroom conversation that matters. Mexico offers a basic set of advantages that are hard to copy. Geography alone changes the math. Mexico can ship by road and rail into the U.S. market. That turns shipping into a controllable problem. A truck route can be rerouted, a rail schedule can be adjusted, a border crossing can be staffed up. Those aren't easy fixes, but they are fixes that feel concrete compared to waiting on global congestion. You can't touch, that's why industrial regions in the north keep lighting up. You hear the same names come up in conversations. Nuevo León, the Monterrey corridor, border-linked hubs that can plug into U.S. distribution fast. The point isn't a single city, the point is the pattern. Build near the pipeline. Build near the crossings. Build near the roads that feed American demand. Lower labor costs than the U.S., but close enough to ship by road and rail. A trade framework under USMCA that gives companies rules they can build around. Industrial zones that already know how to work with American standards, American schedules, American suppliers. And the most underrated piece? A supply chain that can move in days, not weeks. Nearshoring also fixes something people don't talk about enough. Time to react. When your plant is far away, you can't pivot fast. A design change takes months to show up in product. A quality issue takes months to trace. A demand spike turns into empty shelves because the pipeline is too long. When your plant is closer, the feedback loop tightens. You can fix a defect faster. You can switch a supplier faster. You can move inventory by truck instead of waiting for a vessel slot. That flexibility is worth real money, especially in categories where consumer tastes change fast. And yes, Mexico benefits from that. But the U.S. benefits too, because a regional supply chain creates a web of activity on both sides of the border: parts, engineering, logistics, testing, compliance, finance. A lot of value gets pulled back into the U.S. ecosystem in a way China-based production rarely allowed. And here's the engagement question I want you to answer in your head. Do you think the U.S. would rather buy from Mexico where the supply chain is intertwined, or keep feeding a model where the value stays offshore? Because that question is going to shape policy. And look, nearshoring didn't become real because of a trendy buzzword. It became real because it fixes a problem companies are tired of living with. Waiting for ships, waiting for ports, waiting for clearance, waiting for the next political surprise. With Mexico, the wait shrinks, and when the wait shrinks, inventory needs flow, needs change, planning changes, and suddenly the entire operating model feels more manageable. China isn't leaving, it's rerouting, but here's where the story turns. At first, the move to Mexico looks like a Western pivot. US and Europe are leaving China. That's the easy headline. The deeper story is that Chinese companies are following the move into Mexico not to walk away from the U.S. consumer, but to stay attached to it. Think about what that means. Now let's be honest about the tension. The phrase China in Mexico sounds like a trick, and in a way, it is. It lets Chinese firms keep selling to American customers while reducing political exposure. It lets American brands keep buying nearshored goods without fully severing ties to Chinese production know-how. Everyone gets a short-term solution, but short-term solutions attract long-term fights, because once Chinese capital is embedded inside regional supply chains, it becomes hard to separate where something is made from who controls the decision behind it, and that is the real political trigger. So even if a product is assembled in Mexico, the question that keeps coming back is, whose leverage is sitting behind the factory gate? Chinese manufacturers are building plants in Mexico designed for the American market from day one. They're not shipping to Mexico because they love Mexico. They're building in Mexico because it keeps the U.S. market within reach, even when the political temperature rises elsewhere. So China isn't simply losing the U.S. market. China is rerouting the route into the U.S. market, and that changes the fight, because now the question isn't, should the U.S. buy from China? The question becomes, how much Chinese capital can sit inside North America's production zone without triggering backlash? And here's the simple audience question. If you were a policymaker, would you treat a factory in Mexico the same way if it's controlled by U.S.? Capital versus Chinese capital. That question is already shaping decisions. Now, let's talk about the part that's easy to ignore. When you're looking at a map and drawing arrows, Mexico is gaining factories, yes, but Mexico is also absorbing pressure, and pressure always shows the weak spots. When investment surges, things that were fine start becoming limits. Labor markets tighten, wages rise, and suddenly the cheap labor story starts getting less clean. Infrastructure gets stressed, electricity demand jumps, water demand jumps, roads and border crossings get crowded. Logistics becomes a game of timing and bottlenecks again, just in a different place. And then there's security. You don't need a dramatic headline to understand the problem. If a truck gets delayed, if a route gets threatened, if a supplier gets squeezed by extortion, investors feel it fast. Companies don't announce it publicly, but they build it into their pricing, their insurance, their planning. And when enough companies do that, the Mexico is easy narrative starts fading. Politics adds another layer. Investors need predictable rules. They need courts that feel steady. They need contracts that won't turn into a guessing game. When reforms create uncertainty, money pauses, not because everyone panics, but because big capital is patient. It waits for clarity. Mexico is also learning what it means to be strategically important. When you become the key corridor into the U.S. market, you don't just attract factories, you attract attention. Every rule change in Washington echoes across Mexican industrial zones. Every China-related policy debate turns into a Mexico-related investment debate. Mexico gets pulled into questions it didn't create: screening, ownership, technology, subsidies, enforcement. So Mexico isn't simply hosting production. Mexico is balancing between giants while trying to keep the machine running. And that balancing act is where the real risk lives, so Mexico is in a squeeze. More factories are coming, but the systems that support those factories are under strain. More capital is arriving, but investors are also watching the legal and political environment more closely than ever. More demand is building, but the costs and risks inside Mexico are no longer invisible. And it matters because the whole nearshoring bet is built on one promise: stability through proximity. If Mexico starts looking unstable, the bet gets weaker. Now, does that mean Mexico loses? No, it means Mexico becomes the front line, and front lines are expensive. This is also where the labor story gets more complicated. When a region becomes the new hotspot, workers gain bargaining power, wages climb, hiring gets harder, turnover rises. Training becomes a constant grind. Companies start competing not just on products, but on who can keep a stable workforce, and then the pressure spills outward. More factories mean more housing demand, more traffic, more strain on local services, more stress on water and energy systems. You don't need to dramatize it. You just need to watch what happens when industrial parks fill up faster than infrastructure can expand. Mexico can handle growth. The question is whether growth arrives at a pace Mexico can digest, because growth that is too fast doesn't feel like progress. It feels like friction. So here's the viewer question. Do you think Mexico can absorb this scale without breaking something: infrastructure, security, wages? Or do you think the bottlenecks become the next crisis? There's one date that keeps hovering over all of this, and companies don't like saying it out loud because it forces a hard conversation. 2026. That's when USMCA is set for a review, and one of the biggest unresolved issues is China's role inside North American supply chains, not China exporting from afar, but China operating from within the region through plants, partnerships, ownership stakes, and capital flows. So the question becomes painfully simple. How much China inside Mexico will the U.S. tolerate inside the very system that's supposed to secure U.S. competitiveness? And if you think that question won't affect decisions, think again. Billion-dollar investments don't like ambiguity. A factory isn't an app you can update next week. It's steel, land, permits, training, supplier contracts, and years of commitment. When the rules might change, companies pause. When tariffs might hit, companies pause. When political narratives start heating up, companies pause, and tariffs are the other landmine. The auto example is the clearest picture of how sensitive this system is. A single vehicle can include parts that cross borders multiple times before final assembly. A wire harness goes one way, a stamped component goes another. An electronic module goes back again, and only then does the final product roll out. That's efficiency when politics is calm. When politics heats up, that same integration becomes fragile. A tariff on one input doesn't stay on that input. It spreads. It shows up in the price of the entire finished product. It shows up in delays. It shows up in investment getting postponed, because nobody wants to build capacity under moving rules. So the risk isn't only China risk, it's policy risk. And policy risk can break a regional system just as easily as a faraway system if leaders treat tariffs like a clean weapon instead of a blunt instrument. North American manufacturing is deeply integrated: auto parts, electronics, components, and raw materials cross borders again and again before the final product is finished. If tariffs hit any link, the shock runs through the whole chain. Costs rise, delivery slows, plans get revised. So here's the uncomfortable twist. Policies meant to protect the region can end up destabilizing the region, not because the idea is wrong, but because the integration is delicate. Now here's the part people argue about in comments. Is this good or bad for America? The honest answer is, it depends on what you measure. If you measure it by total consumer prices, any friction anywhere can push prices up. If you measure it by industrial activity, a regional chain pulls more work into the North American system. If you measure it by national security thinking, dependence feels dangerous, even if it's profitable. So the fight you're about to see isn't only economic, it's political. And politics is messy because it doesn't care about elegant supply chain logic. China remains massive. That's not going away. But the world is no longer organized around China as the single center. You can't replace. Production is spreading into regions, supply chains are shortening, risk is being priced like it matters because it does. So if you want a single sentence that captures this moment, it's this: the world isn't ending globalization, it's ending blind dependence, and the companies that understand the difference will survive. The ones that don't, won't. Companies still want global customers, they still want big markets, they still want growth. They just don't want a supply chain that collapses because one relationship turns sour. That's why you're seeing regional production zones harden, not to stop trade, but to survive it.